So, what I'm going to do today is it's been a week since my last stream. I took an entire week off from being on the stream. And in that time, I spent some of it just sort of thinking about my projects, sketching out where things might be going. I played a little bit more with the RPG simulator and arrived at a few new ideas. Through doing that, arrived at a few new ideas about what to be doing with my other projects. I still haven't entirely decided where to start. There's honestly just a whole bunch of frontiers that I want to be working on right now, and so I'm trying to sort out which one to do, and that could just be a matter of picking one and getting started, but I'm also just, kind of thinking through the scope of these different frontiers and if there are any paths to cool checkpoints that are nearby or nice ways to pair off. Doing something later can sometimes make it a lot easier than trying to do it first, depending on how it relates to other stuff in the project. So I I just been thinking that through, and I haven't really come to any conclusions yet. But there's so many things that I've started drawing out some diagrams, and I'd like to make an official version of this diagram this week. That I can like post on my website to be sort of like the tech tree that I am attempting to research that has a bunch of different checkpoints of things that I can work on and how they relate to farther projects down the chain. And in order to build that, I want to start with like a sketch version of it, which is what I'm going to do today in discussion with all of you folks here on the stream and in the YouTube VOD viewing section. So let's get started with what my big projects are that I'm going to kind of keep attending to for the medium term. I'm gonna pull up. We're doing Sketchpad today. The big projects that I am intending to include. Well, first of all, there's the RPG simulator. Which contains a few subparts. There's the I don't know what I would call it. I've been calling it the simulator itself, but now that the simulator contains several parts, this is like the core part where it all started. So there's the call it the core for lack of any other name for it, which includes the architecture for running all the rules and the tile scripting and uh, all of the stuff that declares the structure of the game. And I am still working on just this RPG game rule set alongside the core that runs it, and using the two to advance some ideas. And then the RPG simulator also now includes a visual, graphical animator. Maybe I call it like the graphical viewer slash animator, right? That's the second big part of the RPG simulator project that I've got going on. Now, somewhat parallel to this and somewhat intertwined, they're not exactly, they're touching each other all the time. The RPG simulator, as it stands, it's sort of just a project for fun. It's a project that's exciting enough to drive me to do some other cool things. And so one of the cool things coming out of the RPG simulator these days is the C scripting idea. And so I've been working on C scripting a lot. I have a repository for it, and C scripting uh, has basically come to mean research into this structure I've been using that I call a symbol set. Because it turns out everything I ever wanted to do in a C scripting style is very easily achieved with this structure that we found while we were working on the RPG simulator. And So the research frontiers here don't break down in quite as many ways. Like this is kind of two frontiers. This is sort of one frontier, but there's a lot of stuff that we want to do. I have a big to-do list of C scripting stuff. So and another step here, I'm gonna throw in like the small to-do lists, and then finally we'll talk about a tech tree to bind all of the different research projects together. But because C scripting is there, it also is forcing me to look deeper into the next one. Maybe I'm not going to add that arrow. That doesn't. The C scripting requires that I keep pushing my. There we go. Okay, so then there's the object file. That's two. Tab. Oh man, now it's like rolling. How am I doing this? This is happening. Held down. Hold shift now. It doesn't. Um. All right. Object file. Tech. Essentially, we've got things like being able to read the self-image stuff. Right, there's the self-image use case, and then there's also object file manipulation stuff that we're working on. And this is getting used for things like packing shaders right now. And this part over here is tied in with the C scripting, right? This relates back for supporting the C scripting idea. What else? What else? I think that's about everything I've been thinking about. There is another layer here we could expand into that I do have in mind. I've had it in mind the whole time that I've been working on, these lab projects, but we just haven't got there yet. But that's debug file tech. And that is tied in with what I've been thinking about. We're going to like biggest big picture stuff that I'm working on. So there we go. The big projects here that I've sort of outlined include the RPG simulator and all that contains, the C scripting, which is sort of a thing which is primarily being driven by the RPG simulator, but it's a tool that I think we could use in a lot of cases, and there's a lot of frontier on that project too. And then there are these two things. These are not quite big frontiers, but they are underpinning both projects in lots of different ways, and they underpin things I want to get to in the future. Things like this shader packing is something we're relying on in the graphical viewer already. There are ideas about how C scripting could be interconnected with improving how we do the graphical viewer programming stuff, the game engine programming stuff. All right, this is sort of a game engine project. And this one here is sort of a virtual machine kind of thing. And so there are my big frontiers, right? I'm going to just put down stars here, this one, and these two are kind of different parts of the same thing too. So Gabriel Compute, do you find yourself asks me a good question? Do you find yourself more productive streaming online or offline? I'll answer that before I move on to the next part of the sketch here. Do I find myself more productive streaming or offline? I don't think that that's a black and white issue. There are different types of programming tasks and different kinds of moods, and different some moods just make it impossible to do some programming tasks, and some the way those interconnect with the ability to stream is fairly, like, I don't know, it's kind of an intuition thing. So if I'm doing anything where getting distracted to answer questions on the chat regularly uh, would make it impossible to just have a nice, deep, long thought process, then I can't stream that no matter what mood I'm in. Similarly, if I need to do a kind of project which just requires me to be a little um, uh, ruthless, like if I need to just sit and make a grid of all the tasks and check them off one by one for 2 straight hours, grind it out, I can do that on a stream, but I don't talk a lot when I do. And so depending on my mood, I might just do that in private, keep it to myself when I have to do that kind of thing. Well, sometimes it's fun to put it on and take a couple breaks in the middle. And then there are other things like this where I'm kind of just sketching and exploring where honestly, it might be better to do it on stream. It keeps it a little bit more real. If I do I've spent a whole week kind of playing around with these ideas. That was probably because I needed a break from streaming, but I think it actually helps a lot to hash ideas out in a group. So there you go. All right, so those are the big projects. Now, there's actually a whole bunch of to-dos to explain under all of these. So let's go through them one at a time. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to write RPG Simulator Core. Yeah. And so some of the to-dos going on here are things like um, I mean, some big ones here are I have the tile board structure. Now this one I have started. I've done the very first. Where did that doc come? Tile board. Status on this one is I've started a very rudimentary tile board. So there's like first pass, check. And at some point, I want to get y'all up to date on how that went and what that looks like. But following off from that, there's sort of access optimizations and memory size, like size optimizations. There's a lot we could do to explore this. And if we explore it, it's going to feed into the C scripting and symbol set project. Okay, so this is going to expand our understanding of what we can do with the C scripting, because we're going to, in order to do the access optimizations and the size optimizations, we're basically going to build a compiler or like a very, it's not really a compiler. Better to think about it as a meta program. It's going to generate C code, but it's going to do a layout and like packing optimization on the tile state, which is defined in all the tile protos, and essentially make a new struct. Except that there are new rules for accessing this kind of struct. The min and max values of each thing can be clamped either by a static limit or by dynamic limit, depending on the type of the field, things like that. So we're going to end up exploring how I would make as fast as possible accessor and size optimizer, and as small as possible size optimization at the same time. And the way that that's going to have to happen is by generating some C code through the C scripting that describes the optimal packing given the set of tiles. So that's the tile board stuff. The tile board stuff also leads into possibly another expanding frontier to open up, which is we probably should set up some performance analysis. That probably isn't too hard to crack it open to begin with, but it might not stay easy, right? I've got Spall up and set up in my code base already, so I can just equip my system with the existing Spall profiler and get started. But actually curating good markup, like especially if you're going to do manual markup, which is what I'm going to be doing probably, since I never got automatic markup fully where I want it. And I could maybe update Spall and see if the newest one is ready, but I'm not sure if it is going to be easy to do that. So this could be a little bit of work, a little bit of hassle to finish setting up a full performance analysis that really does what I want, depending on what ultimately the most likely outcome I think is that I'm just going to curate a set of like manual markup for sections that I want to analyze, and so that's just going to be some curation, right? It's just going to over time going to have to get built up properly. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to get I don't know what we call this. We call like sort of like runtime guarantees or something. As I'm building out this core, this is the first big performance booster thing that I've been working on, and I'd like to measure how well this is going and all that. The next big thing is that the RPG simulator core should have the ability to equip different properties to the simulation. Right now, the properties that it has are that it only it has bot brain, so it never needs to get interrupted for player moves. Like a human player doesn't need to be factored in, so certain things can run faster with that. And yet there are still pieces of code in there that are prepped for a human player, and so I don't have these like switches for different activation modes. But that's not the only piece of the core runtime that I want to develop. There's also, for the graphical viewer, a need to export some kind of a log that describes the state of the world, or maybe the state of the world as viewed by a specific player, or something like that. Maybe I need both. Maybe I need a full state of the world for debug purposes, so there needs to be some kind of God's eye view log of the whole simulation, and not a text-based log, but a structured log. And then there needs to be another structured log that is maybe somehow projected from that or something, right? So there's this issue of how do I create an interface to the human player, and somewhere along the way you have to know what you are supposed to show the player and what you're not supposed to show the player. And so if there's supposed to be a hidden information component, whether or not that's thought of as a log all the way through, or if it's a very trivial like extra accessor on top of a log or something, I don't know. I don't know how that wants to work out architecturally, but I want to figure out how to sort out a God's eye view and a player view and a structured log together. And for a structured log to make any sense, you also need a better stable ID system than I have for your entities. Now, this was a necessary step that I took last week because getting to the tile board means I no longer have tile entities in my RPG simulator. So the architecture on entities can now start getting there. So all of this together is like core mechanism development. And it includes some steps like time stable unique IDs for entities. And then structured log. And that is going to feed into our RPG viewer animator. That's going to unlock that frontier a little bit, because there were a lot of things we wanted to do here that just would have made more sense if we already had a structured log up and running. And then another piece of this is once you have a log where you can see what events happen across time, it does sort of start to beg for a final completion of this feature combination. We've got unique stable IDs across time. We've got a structured log of what happened over time. Finally, you're also able to do a serialization, deserialization system so that you can start restoring old states of the simulation, right? You want to be able to say like, okay, we have a structured log up to across 100 player decisions. We want to go to decision 30 and restore the state from there, and then run a different decision and see what happens, or modify the state of the world a little bit somehow and see what happens, or whatever, right? We want to be able to sort of freely move around inside of the simulated states by being able to say we can restore anything. And then if you go from a particular state and you go into like a debug editor, God's eye view, which we don't have one of those yet, but if we had one of the things you would want to rely on is the ability to restore these states and modify and run again and see what happens and stuff like that. And once this is available, it can also be built into the rules of the game that there are assumptions of rewinding the state or tracking other states or redos or something, right? You could imagine, even if I'm making something that does want to work like a roguelike where it's permadeath, that doesn't mean that it isn't useful to have a mode where save states exist. And so how am I going to support that if I ever want that? This is also important because it feeds into another problem regarding C scripting. And the symbol sets, which is that in general, anyone using my symbol set system is going to have a question when it comes time to start serializing data that contains references to these symbols, right? This is going to be a weak point of this thing I've developed. And so I want to study it and be prepared with a solution, because maybe I can turn that weak point into a strong point, right? The symbol sets are not giving you a stable, manually authored enum, which it could be a concern, right? If the IDs from one build to the next can be rearranged, that means you can't just load in the IDs and check for against a table. You can't just keep an old enum around and mark it as defunct. It you don't have some of the same options you have with a basic manually authored enum, and that's possibly going to suck. The workaround might be something you can automate. It might be something you can compress. It might not be that big a deal, or it might always be painful. And then I should know that before I go recommending this technique to everybody. But I need to figure out how good it can get. Right, that's the part of the question. So C scripting and symbol set also got a serialization deserialization component in it, but for the purposes of the RPG simulator, we would have to get through all the rest of this, the new ID system for the entities, and that includes like entity allocation as well. Right now, I just kind of allocate new entities as needed. I would need some kind of recycling, memory management, garbage collection on these entities that I don't have right now. And so this is a big project, and then this is a big project which relates to the graphical stuff I'm working on, which finally unlocks the serialization deserialization problem in the RPG simulator, which could feed the C scripting stuff, but I might just say, you know what, that's going to be such a long path to get from where I'm at to C scripting payoff that maybe I want to jump the gun and practice a different serialization deserialization thing. I don't know. That's part of what I'm sorting out. Do I want to just be very patient? You know, sometimes I feel like these research projects do go better when I arrive at them through real projects, like through things which are making full contact with reality the whole way through, with a whole bunch of ongoing interests that I am tending to, and then I arrive at a research checkpoint and I'm actually getting some real information about how things work and how well they work. If I spoof it, I can get it done probably several months sooner. But is it real? I don't know. I'm never quite sure. So maybe the patience is still the way to go, but I want to map out what we're waiting on here. Yeah, this is a different payoff C scripting, which is a little bit more immediately available. Now, another thing going on with the RPG Simulator core that I want to develop is I'm still working out more and more stuff about the without being able to see it right there. Oh, give me one moment. Okay. Little interruption, but that's over. Let's see. What was I doing? Right. So, point number 3 on this project is I'm still developing like the actual game mechanics slash rules, and that's not, it's actually a fairly interesting part of it because so much of that drives more C scripting discoveries. Um, and I could spell out more of what I'm thinking about doing there. I'm not sure that I actually need to spell out what's happening here. Most of this just has to do with, uh, game designy stuff that I'm doing on RPG Simulator. And yeah, I'm not sure how I would. There's just no way for me to summarize it. You're just gonna have to wait and see what I'm doing. I haven't thought much about how to describe what that process is like. So that's what's going on just here with the RPG Simulator core stuff. And then we can also spell out some issues I've got in the RPG Simulator graphics stuff. So to-dos. For the RPG Simulator graphics, animations, whatever I'm calling that half of the project. The biggest one, there's just a first pass problem of I need to go through and do another pass. So I need to do another rendering pass. There's combining the two modes of rendering more deeply. What I mean by that is my 2D font, rect, and 3D sprite need to get more better combined. I need to be able to do sprites in 2D. I want to be able to place text in 3D. So there's that. Plus, I just don't like the structure that I have right now where I have kind of two different buffers and I have to flush them a couple times each to get like basic rectangle fills in the background, followed by a 3D render, followed by UI text, and the swapping back and forth is just super badly architected because it's just two different systems pasted together in the most sloppy way possible. So there's a big, deep, like, couple day rework of my renderer that still needs to happen. There's also some artifacts. I'm having an aliasing around around giant pixel edges, and I know what that's caused by. The buffer blend problem. So a couple ways I might go about fixing that and dealing with that issue, but I need to do that too because I want to make this look nice. And then there's, like a bunch of stretch goals. I have a bunch of these listed out already in the visualizer too, but these are the two big ones that I think are like early on I need to be able to do. Um, Things like lighting shaders and other effects. I think that's like a later on kind of problem, but these are bothering me right now. They are doable. So that's something I can work on without needing to wait at all for any of the stuff that's going on over here. That's not relevant to the structured log issue. But the next big thing I want to do with the RPG simulator is I want to be able to start seeing more. I need to invest more deeply into like attaching visualizations to simulation state. And so in order to do that, I'm going to be relying on C scripting stuff. This all feeds into ideas about the C scripting symbol set research. And I could make a to-do list, but honestly, a lot of that to-do list has to be discovered. Like I need sprites for tiles. I need sprites for characters in the 2D mode, and should that be the same sprite as the one they use in the 3D mode, or should they have like a face portrait sprite that is different? How do I want that to work? How do I want to make backups so that whenever I have a missing asset, I can keep running the simulation and just leave it as a to-do that it's not filled in. That this particular tile or this particular character is missing a sprite, so a default is always available for these things, and a default that lets me at least read the information off of a piece of text that's still visible, so that I know what I'm looking at from the perspective of the simulation, even when I haven't attached visuals yet. Because at a certain point, I would still like to be able to run lots of simulations and not need to talk about how to treat all of it as a game. I might want to have to develop. I'd be down for testing out game ideas with placeholders, but that are still full information, fully providing all the information, and then only develop game assets for the things that I'm really counting on using. And then there's other parts, like as this gets more advanced, there's also like how do I want to attach combinations of visualization information? Like how am I going to create environments for different how am I going to create environments, and what am I even attaching environments to in the simulation? There's all kinds of stuff like that left to explore, and all of that's going to help me understand more and more what I can and can't do with C scripting. Other stuff that could follow from that is also like running the entire asset system off of C scripting, right? That's all going to feed into the C scripting research. What is better with a symbol set, right? I just kind of want to use symbol set everywhere and see where it succeeds and see where it fails. So there's all of those things. There's also like the debug view problem in general, and that includes like developing controls for arranging visual tests, right? I want to be able to test out if the graphic system and the art looked good together and are doing what I want. So I want to be able to test out visual effects and stuff. I want to make visual tests with the debug viewer. And then I want to be able to control a simulation state. And of course, that one is dependent on making more progress on the core issues that we talked about earlier. But that there's a big one that I want to make progress on, and so possibly driving for that would have the effect of meaning we would try for this, but controlling the simulation state from the viewer is also a UI problem. So this would feed into C scripting for UI kinds of questions. And I am pretty curious about that. So this is one of the things I might fast track. I might say we want to get all of this core stuff done, not because we're looking for these checkout points, but well, this one, but because we are looking to get to this one and then study this C scripting issue in detail. Because I am real curious to see C scripting and UI collide, and there's just a few things I need to honestly, both of these parts are gonna feed that same thing. Right, right. Now, let's talk about to-dos regarding the C scripting project. Why dimension with a T? Because um, when I first made that screen name, uh, it was on a website called Yo-Yo Games, and I was like 10. It was like a game. It was a Game Maker Games website. You could make a game on Game Maker and upload it there, and it was really cool. I was 10. I was into the idea of making games, and I made an account, and I didn't have a very good grasp on how to manage passwords and stuff. So I forgot how to log in and had already used Fourth Dimension spelled with an S as a screen name. So I didn't really. This was like the first time I ever engaged with the internet as a kid, and didn't know the like password reset's not that big a deal and stuff. So I just made another account and used a name that didn't conflict, and I've kept the T ever since. Okay. So C scripting stuff to work on. One issue is okay. So I mean, there's a lot of fronts to make progress on C scripting. A few of the basics are porting to Elf and Macho. Basically, the C scripting and to Linux has to get ported both on the object file format and on the operating system. So I need to make ports for the C scripting implementations. And that is going to mean I'm going to have to develop object file tech that I don't have. There's also an issue of refined uh, object file handling. So right now, C scripting is implemented on top of just a sort of copy paste of my old object file tech. And so this is another thing where it's like, okay, in order to slim down the C scripting, what I actually have to do is just go and develop better object file tech. Right? And then another thing I can do with C scripting is I can do the object file uh, editing part. This would allow me to like minimize the extra data sections, or it's not even minimize. This is just letting me eliminate extra data section. But in order for that to work, I would actually also want to have so this would be like object file editing. And debug file editing. Because what you really want here is that you can rearrange the global variables themselves into a single data section, the dot data section, the normal one, and just fix up the symbols for the pointers and the counts in the object file editing. But if you do all of that, your debug information will no longer be able to report you would not be able to report correct information to the debugger about where those symbols all end up in memory. So that would kind of suck. And so that would mean developing both of these. Honestly, it's not even driving them in this case. It's kind of depending on them. Right, I would need to be more confident in object file editing and in debug file editing. So we're going to talk more about things I could do for object file editing and debug file editing in smaller steps, because this is a huge step. I don't have, the only object file editing I have so far is the packer, the OBJ from raw. We are going to incorporate that into our conversation about this. That reminds me, over here there is another research project I would love to touch in the graphics section here, which is C scripting and OBJ from raw for shader programming. I'd like to see how all of that works together and how far you can push automating your shader bindings using these tools, because I think that we could do a lot with that. And of course, this just feeds into C scripting. And object file tech. Okay, but in addition to all of this stuff that depends on developing object file stuff, there's also some other things going on. There's metaprogramming. And this is going to exist in conjunction with my RPG simulator project. A tile board, or let's say RPG simulator. Tile board optimizations. So that's the use case I have for metaprogramming already. Yeah. And there's more to do with C scripting still. We also need to develop all this research, this is testing the field out, seeing what it's like. Then there's just the issue of developing examples. And usage tips, like debugging. And that's just purely for developing the C scripting stuff to get it more ready to share with the world. So some of this stuff should maybe only happen after more vetting and more discovery, but there are plenty of examples that I could develop now with what I know. And so that's just a whole big project that I have to make progress on sometimes. So how are we doing here? I've got like, each of these is like a big frontier that I have in mind. Some of them go together. The metaprogramming research for C scripting goes together with the core development optimizations. The all of the rest of the C scripting development besides example development kind of goes with my object file debug file stuff, which we're going to spell out last. Over here, some of this, this here feeds into more C scripting research, and object file research. This one feeds into C scripting research and also is interconnected with this core stuff. Um, Here's the serialization deserialization test case for C scripting in symbol set. Metaprogramming research. There's another one kind of equivalent that's like serializing system search, which just goes hand in hand with the RPG simulator core. Um, Streamer asks, why aren't you making a virtual machine for your scripting? Isn't your approach of creating object files insanely hard? Well, that's the research question, isn't it? So far, it's been extremely easy. I tried doing this a year ago by building it up from the ground up with a like bytecode virtual machine kind of approach, and that was insanely hard, and I kind of stalled out. What I'm doing now lets me use all of the features of the C language, and in fact lets me know that things like arithmetic are and just basic memory access patterns, like I have a context with 10 variables, here they are, here's how I access them. All of that's now happening through a fastest possible C compiler kind of output. I kind of like that, and I'd kind of like to think that instead of developing a bytecode language, what I'm actually doing is just developing ways to use all the things C already has to the way they're built without and build orthogonally to the existing language, right? If I think of it another way, there is a virtual machine that I'm basically building. It's just that I don't want to have to code that virtual machine with bytecode. I just code it with C functions. And where did I write down the virtual machine part? Right, yeah, the core right here, the virtual machine. So I don't know if that answers your question, but so far this object file stuff is not insanely hard compared to um, developing a bytecode interpreter. And the parts that are difficult are kind of one-time fixes. Like the more I develop my object file tech, the less I think about the way the object files are. The lighter weight they become, the more I feel like I'm just kind of building stuff naturally with the structures they provide. The only part that is gonna suck is if I want to keep debug info correct once I start rearranging symbols. I think that is going to be a deep problem to untangle in a clean way, but I think it's possible. We're going to figure out a way. So, all right, that's most of what I have to say about C scripting. Let's wrap up. I'll put it underneath since I filled the horizontal space that time. Let's wrap up with the do's for right size. To do's for object file tech. So what's going on here is basically we need to, first of all, there's kind of just the porting problem. Any one of these I do, there's always a porting problem at each point, right? This whole thing is behind a platform layer abstraction because it has to be. There's no um, there's no layer at which I abstract away base of this and then can build on top of it, at least not right now. If there's a way to do that, that's in the future. So there's basically four main prongs here: object, file, parsing is the first prong, and there's the lightweight use cases of that, and then there's the like heavyweight. I'll just call it the heavyweight version of that, the heavyweight. Lightweight goes to things like C scripting, and the self image stuff in particular. Right, so what we're doing there is we are relying on our ability to parse the object file, specifically the image version of an object file. It's the loaded running program, but it's all the same. We're using our ability to parse our own image in order to find the C scripting data. Now later, if we develop object file editing, then we can get to a different version of C scripting where self image isn't needed. But there's also heavyweight uses of object file editing, like visual table viewers, linkers, object file editors. You can't edit what you can't read, right? Then there's part two. Prong two is the object file. Editing. Now, some of the things you can do with object file editing are pretty easy, straightforward things like, so there's like a lightweight category. And there's things like the OBJ from raw, which I use for packing shaders. And then there's use cases like well, there's stuff we haven't done, but there's like how do I want to call this? I could just call these empty symbol. The empty symbol files. These are basically just generators. Notice they do not actually edit an existing object file. They just generate one from scratch. So empty symbol lists. The reason you might want something like this is for ideas like inserting constants after compilation. Like the tile board access optimizations might work this way. There might not be a lot of good arguments for this particular branch of tech, though. Might be defunct if metaprogramming works out better. A lot of stuff here is like metaprogramming could actually be a post, like a, how do I put this? We could use symbol sets to drive a metaprogramming that could solve many of the same problems. And they're both kind of post processors on the data, but it's possible that this post processor on the data is just going to be less effective overall, because if the metaprogramming just works out, then it can insert constants that are whose values are known from the front end, right? The compiler could see the constant and actually inline it. There's a kind of, in fact, that might be the phrase I want to put in here. There's like a problem with C scripting called that I might call like the C scripting inlining problem. The inlining problem. In general, which is like metaprogram or post-process OBJ generators. And I'm not sure. The downside to metaprogramming is that it makes build flows less linear. You have to be careful about what source text is expected to be visible from different parts of your definitions. It gets very annoying and fiddly, and then you have generated code in your repository and other things you got to watch out for. But it does mean that the inliner gets to see what's happening. When you do things in a post processor that generates an object file to link in, the problem you get there is that things like constants actually have to be treated slightly less efficiently, because the constant wasn't known to the compiler. It couldn't build it in, like, you know, some instruction sets have spots where if you're accessing something with a value under, you know, 255 or something, it can be encoded in a totally different instruction that's way more compact than if it thinks, well, we're going to load a constant from some variable that I don't know what it is yet, but I'll find out what its location is. And then once we load that constant, or even if it's just we're going to load a constant into a register, that constant won't be known until link time, and so that constant is, you know, loaded into the register with one instruction and executed. There are opportunities for inlining constants that are lost, is the point, potentially. And so I'm not sure that I actually want to go that route of post-processing objects, or post-processing the symbol sets into objects. That might be the wrong approach. Metaprogramming might give me better results. But there are downsides to that too, and it does depend on how easy it works out. It feels like C scripting might make metaprogramming just almost automatically free, but it could also have some real downsides that that I still don't like. Right? I've always ended up touching metaprogramming only to find a way to remove it later. So we'll see how that goes. So that's object file editing lightweight. I have a question in chat, so I'm going to switch to that and then fill in more details about what heavyweight object file editing might look like. But first, going to the chat, are you generating the OBJ files yourself, or do you let the compiler generate the code? And concerning the inlining, are you making a JIT compiler? Okay. Am I generating the object files myself? Yes, I have an object file generator that generates my packed shader objects right now. And I have a set of tools for sort of generically generating object files that I just haven't developed very deeply yet. They're just sort of a first pass proof of concept. One of the projects I'm working on here is to push that to the point that I can rely on it for more things like the empty symbol list and ultimately for heavyweight object file editing. So to summarize, when I say metaprogramming, that it means generating source code for the purpose of letting a compiler generate and insert data into the compilation process. And anytime I'm talking about object file generating, I'm talking about object file generating sans compiler, right? No compiler involved, no source code involved. Okay, so heavyweight object file editing really goes hand in hand with, you really can't do one of these without the other. Object file editing really needs debug file editing. But this would enable things like C scripting, Mark II, which basically means no added data sections, all symbol, no runtime, no raw symbol uh, encodings. We would be able to just statically encode the actual IDs correctly once we make a little tweak to the object file. But once we start tweaking the object file, that by literally moving memory around inside the image, we need to be able to modify the debug file in order to see them properly. And that means that C scripting Mark II is really actually gated on points 3 and 4 here, which also need to happen first, which are debug file parsing and debug file editing. I haven't even touched this problem yet in this context. I've worked on debug file editing and debug file, whoops, I wrote debug file parsing twice. The second one is debug file editing. Right. And once we've done that, that unlocks projects like C scripting Mark II, like I said before. Also, once we have debug file parsing, we might want to look into like an auto tweaker. And we might want to look into a dependency grapher for C scripts. So that's my giant to-do list board. Finally, what I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to take a quick break first because I've been here for an hour despite I had a little interruption, but setting aside the little interruption, I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to draw the tech tree for all of this stuff I want to build with, unlocks that are appropriately ordered so that I'll know certain things. Like we know for a fact that C scripting Mark II isn't coming until after debug file editing, which is not coming until after debug file parsing. So like there are certain things we just know where the order has to happen. And there are many where the order is sort of loosely interconnected, but not fully interconnected between certain things. And so I just want to sort out what the full tech tree looks like and also put in some estimates and some checkboxes and stuff. There's the porting problem. So anywhere where a porting problem exists, I want to put down the Windows, Linux, and Mac checkboxes and stuff. I'm going to sketch out what the whole thing looks like. And I'm going to try to save that and turn it into a proper roadmap style image that I can then share on my website and stuff like that, just to sort of map out like what's everything I'm taking on for the next year or more regarding all these projects. And once I have that in one place, I think it'll no longer feel like I have to carry it all in my head. I'm no longer going to feel like it's an internal space, and I'll probably within a month regret having created it because I'll see all kinds of ways in which it's inaccurate and missing things that I actually care about and overemphasizing things I don't care about. But oh well, I'm just gonna sketch one out for now and see where we go. So that's the goal. Let me take my 5-minute break, and I will come back to do that final ordering of the tech tree task. Okay, gonna make a little Like a little 5-minute break sign. All right, back. All right, I'm ready. Okay, so the challenging part here is going to be to get the order correct in such a way that I can actually fit a lot of stuff together. Okay, let me just throw in some stuff that I didn't mark here. This says refined object file handling. What I really mean is C scripting Mark II. Wait, no, that's not what that means. That's right. That's the lightweight. parsing of objects. Then there's this one, which is Mark II. Okay. When I put down the C scripting thing, there are things like metaprogramming research, serialization system research. While I'm at it, let me go look at my to-do list because I've written down a bunch more specifics. We're gonna need shrink, fork cutter down a little bit. That should be good. Show me C scripting to do. Don't need. Yeah. Yeah. Right, and there's also the DLL shared object stuff. I should also include that research. Practical use tips. IDs for profiler blocks. You can actually include that because I was talking about performance with the tiles, right? That's in there too. Honestly, it's like it goes everywhere. It just goes. It literally is the way I want to program so much stuff. The more I look at it. Whew. And honestly, I'm holding some cards close because there are other ideas that I've always suspected are related to this that I haven't even opened the can of worms to like figure out how to talk about them yet. And now that I'm looking at how many of the like I'm just doing one little project, the RPG simulator, and I'm finding that every corner of it feels different with C scripting and a symbol set at my disposal now. Right, there's all of that. And that's so much. So this is Mark II. This is a question about if I'm going to maintain Mark I and Mark II together. Yeah, that's upstairs now. Could symbol sets and hex be organized? That's an interesting other upgrade research. And let's make this a part of the... to do there. Okay. All right, so that's good to see. I have the main.c for RPG simulation here with a bunch of to-dos. Separate concept. That's just local stuff, local questions. Just a local data structure problem. Default brain. That's not very specific. This could lead to some interesting discoveries about RPG or about the C scripting system, but as could this and this, but it's hard to predict what that might look. That's just exploratory research at best. Possibly driving new discoveries, constructing different players, list of bot brain mode. This one, I mean, it relates insofar as any of the optimization stuff that I care about relates to C scripting. Put into separate DLLs. Okay, this is a direct interconnection between the two. I want the RPG simulator to have a plugin system, and I want the C scripting to be tested relative to plugins. I also want to test plugin systems with my base layer. So even my base layer fits into this diagram when I include that. That's not a big deal. Object file editing to finish the magic, write in values, right? This is all to-dos that live in C scripting now. This is the end of that to-do section. So there's stuff in the simulation main. There's also the graphics main that has a bunch of to-dos. I think most of these will be ones I'll ignore for the purposes of this tech tree, except to say develop the game engine graphic systems. Each state that you stop at visually somehow, yeah, that's a part of the authoring problem. Animation move tiles played in order of execution. Upgrade the simulator to support move, cue, pause, resume. Yeah, that's a part that's actually done. And part of the core transitions between states, log of simulation. That's all. Structured log of restore previous states from log. This is all in the core to-do list now. Write scripts, design graphics to tiles. This is all a part of the UI development stuff. That will test out some of the C scripting stuff. I don't really need to break it down into specifics. UI is UI at a certain point. Like all just save game arrange formation. This is graphic stuff. This is all defining more of the rendering. I'm gonna group all that together into one big blob. Just game engine graphic system, game engine UI system, and asset system. This is all graphics / animation system. So yeah, none of that's gonna need to be detailed out in the tech tree beyond just a summary. I looked at C scripting, I looked at main, I looked at. Let me look at my base layer too. What have we got going on in this area? So where I left off, I was developing the base layer, trying to figure out how I would make it support a plugin architecture. And I've been developing a real project that would create the space for a plugin architecture to actually make meaningful sense. That's what the RPG simulator was on day one. And it took a while to get there, but we're very much there. And I could see that being the next big thing, because that would let me finally close the book on the base layer upgrade that was for making plugin support possible. And it would let me open the door to C scripting interconnecting with a plugin system and how that needs to be architected around. And that is actually going to matter because things like the tile board optimizations I am trying to develop are optimizations that I want those to work after it's a plugin system, right? I want to be able to make high-speed tile board optimizations in light of a world where there's also a plugin system. And that may mean that it cannot be so easy as metaprogramming suggests it could be, right? Or it might not even be possible to do it as well as you could if there was no plugin system, right? The fact that it's a plugin system might just mean that there's a lower ceiling on what you can do to optimize your tile boards, but I kind of don't think so. I kind of think the tile board optimization could be the kind of thing where we push it pretty far on a table driver, and then to get any further, we need just-in-time compiling somehow. And that's not a door that I'm afraid to open. That might be a part of what I'm trying to build too. So it does feel like plugin systems should come first to me, because I do care about that. Part of what I'm doing all this research for, just a little bit of like a peek behind the curtains. Part of what I'm doing all this research for is after I built 4Coder, I saw how the customization layer stuff worked out. And I wanted to get better at building plugin system architectures, because I think ultimately that's what you need to develop a new kind of programming. Honestly, what we have now is a plugin architecture at the base. It's like an operating system is a giant plugin system, and then each application is one plugin to it that lets you make it do a bunch of stuff. And now usually we don't think of plugins that way. We don't think of there being a plugins user space and a core space. It's just all in the user space, right? But I think a new programming could be built if only we were better at making open compositional systems. And so I think understanding how to build a plugin system architecture has to be a core piece of the plan for building a new interface to constructing software in general. And so I just want to be good at it. It's one of the things I want to be able to be good at. And by being good at it, what I mean is I want to know, how things sort out best. Where does the cookie crumble, and what is the limit on how far you can push things? And I don't know how to do that except to build a real project around all of these things. But underneath all of the other projects I'm doing, I'm ultimately trying to get to this point. And so maybe this is the one I want to start on. But let's go make that tech tree. I think I see what to write now. Put it somewhere relative. Here we go. You know what? That's a mistake. I can't put the label on it because I need to on the top. I have to put the label on it on the bottom because I'm gonna start from the bottom and grow upward. Here is the text tree. Okay. Very most primitively, there are object file parsing. All this comes with the operating system checkboxes. And object file parsing enables things like there is technically also just the abstraction of the self-image accessor. It's not that's such a lightweight peak, so I'm gonna leave. There's C scripting. Mark 1. Is unlocked here and have done that. Now, the way the tree works is if you want Windows support for this node, you have to have Windows support for all of the preceding nodes. And you can't check something until something before it is checked, but this check means I've built it, but I haven't built the Linux or Mac ports, so this doesn't work on Linux or Mac. That's kind of the logic I'm adding there. Now, once you have object file parsing, you can also develop object file editing. Let's just start with object file generating. That's actually a good name for the first chunk here. And for that, again, we have a check mark, Windows part, back some backup. Make the arrows a different here. This. Now, another thing you can develop once you've developed object file parsing is you can expand that into debug file parsing. And in my code base, we don't know how to do that yet. We haven't done this for any platform. Once you have debug file parsing, you can build some cool technologies. You can do a fact that this with debug file reading, you can do like symbol dependency graphing. Which checkbox. Obviously, haven't done this. Stuff like that. It gives you type info. It means you can do like how do I put this? You could do well, I just don't have any projects in mind for this right now. Once you know the type layouts, though, you can do stuff with that. I don't have anything in mind for what to do with that yet. No, the object file generator isn't anything sophisticated like code optimizations or constant collapsing. The object file generator is just the amount of code that it takes to specify the object file format. It doesn't do anything about like assembly in machine instruction generation is a different level, right? This is just taking machine instructions as opaque data that we can do relocations on, but we don't know how to generate new machine instructions, right? We're not trying to do any of the compilation work. So anything that can't be done when the compiler sees it, right? The compiler can inline, as we were talking about this earlier. The compiler can inline constant collapses. Object file generator cannot. Although the object file generator is kind of a free step, it doesn't even generate code usually. It's just usually generating like global variables and symbols that don't even reference real memory, but that are just constants that you want to deliver to to another object file or something. Um, yeah, and also the auto tweaker idea. That's the one I was looking for, right? So you can build something like an auto tweaker. If you have bug information. But for this one, you need another layer, which is debug process control. And for that, you do need a port. Operating system. Once you have one of those, then you can build an auto tweaker. Because the debug file contains stuff like type information and where symbols are located in the running program. So what an auto tweaker would do would be the same thing a debugger does, but instead of doing it for stopping and looking at all the code, it would just be for making a tweaker where you can modify some variables that you marked as tweakable or something like that. Now, once you've done this and this, then presumably there's like a high level object file, object slash debug editing world. Now, I'm kind of combining it all here because I don't think these can go separately from each other very easily. Whether or not they need separate ports, I'm not sure. But they very well could. It could be that you just kind of use an intermediate format and then you port a Windows, Linux, and Mac renderer. So you got a OBJ file generator from a intermediate type and for each operating system format, and then you do the same thing for debug files, and then you do all of your editing by parsing things into the shared format, make your modifications, and then push it back out. But that would still mean that there's a porting problem here. That abstraction actually doesn't hide the porting problem at this layer. This would be the layer that provides that abstraction. The arrows here indicate that this is kind of a goal. The knowledge that it would take to do this would build on top of the knowledge built here, right? There's not necessarily code dependencies in my arrows here. I'm thinking more like technology, science, research, like it's a tech tree, right? You have to know how to be able to, if you couldn't do this, then you won't be able to get away with doing this or this. These are building on top of what you learn in doing this in some way. Now, once you have that, that's where you get to C scripting Mark II coming a thing. This C scripting Mark II, which is C scripting but with better optimizations. Much better optimizations. Because it lets you do things like, first of all, eliminate all the extra data sections that you would otherwise have to add to the executable. A lot more stuff can be initialized at link time instead of at runtime. And certain constants can be known, can be resolved at link time rather than having to be computed at runtime every time they're referenced. All that kind of stuff becomes more possible once we have full object debug editing. But we can't really do object editing by itself without losing debuggability, and that's just a no-go to me. You got to keep your tools working, right? You got to build the thing that fully solves the problem. You don't fully solve the problem if you make a trade-off out of thin air. So C-scripting Mark II has to be fairly down the line. Now, we are not far. If we wanted to just get a Windows version of C-scripting Mark II to be our goal, we could get there that way. But there's another thing lurking in all this, and that's my base layer. Currently, I have just a Windows port of the base layer. And I'm trying to get to base, why don't we call this like a plugin architecture? I've built the base layer. The plugin architecture I am still learning how to incorporate into the base layer's structure. And once I have looked at that, there's separately a sort of C scripting plugin architecture expansion. Possibility, right? I want to figure out how the plugin architecture itself goes with the C scripting. And in order to research that, well, I guess there's kind of a Mark 1 and a Mark 2 version. C scripting Mark 1 version and a C scripting Mark 2 version. So we get some kind of a structure here where C scripting Mark 1 is the dependency of this, C scripting Mark 2 is a dependency for this version, right? Okay, now in addition to what I've listed out here so far, there are some other little things we can tap into. When we get object file parsing up and running, we can get some viewer tools, viewer utilities, or let's just call these OBJ utilities or that. And we might actually develop those on top of C scripting. And that's a little project. It's also going to be like debug utils. Build some debug utilities whenever we've got some debug file parsing, and again, in the mix. Um, Also, still a thought of developing our own linker, because once we do that, we could start going a whole nother level with what we do. Gonna need a port. Because once we've got our own linker, we could start going much farther. That could unlock a whole like C scripting Mark III kind of thing. It could unlock new options for types of programs. We could, like, this would unlock an unbelievably large frontier of options for us. Um, Now there are just a whole bunch of C scripting. Uh, there is just like a whole bunch of C scripting things. So I'm gonna make a cut here. This is sort of my object file, debug file, plugin architecture, focused tech tree. All right. Okay. Starting again, focusing on all the things I can develop on scripting. I'm gonna go like this. We want to look at what we can develop with scripting. Mark 1. Scripting Mark 2. And also the C scripting plugin architecture. And some of the things we can look into here are things like there's the inlining problem is definitely one of the big ones I want to look at. And I think inlining problem there's the what's interesting is it's like I could look at the inlining problem with each of these being involved, like with or without the plugin architecture, whether you're doing Mark 1 or Mark 2 C scripting, the inlining problem changes for every combination. 1, 2, 4 different combinations. of this, right? There's inlining problem with just C scripting and plugin, C scripting 2, scripting 2 and plugin. App, plugin architecture on the right, Mark 1 bottom, then plugin architecture. This one. Research questions like this one, which actually might have variance across these 4 different combinations. What else are we dealing with here? So this is inlining. This is the metaprogramming question, which relates to the inlining question. Metaprogramming. One of the possible solutions to the problem. Other possible solution to the problem is OBJ post processing. This one requires that we're already in a kind of C scripting Mark II territory. That would be a part of the C scripting Mark II. Metaprogramming could be the solution either way. There's also the serialization problem, which does in fact have a difference depending on whether or not you're looking at the plugin architecture version. Now, does the C scripting Mark 1 and Mark 2 differentiation matter there? Not as much. The big difference is, I suppose the big difference is you could, once you're in C scripting Mark 2, you could actually start doing more to control the order allocation of slots for these IDs. Factory for C script. Let me pop over to the list from the scripting. What else we have going on? Metaprogramming I've included. Bugger. Visualization problem. Shader management. I think shader management it doesn't I don't think that has much to do with this part. It's not that sort of thing. No, it would work about the same. There might be a plugin architecture question there, but even that seems a little orthogonal to the C scripting part of the plugin architecture. And then the profiler IDs. Yeah. For what to do to explore here with the tech tree or with the C scripting. The C scripting again, I don't think the mark matters as much there. It probably matters a little bit. Like this gets better in an important way when you're on C scripting Mark II. And it may also be that what you actually do is you just rely on metaprogramming. Metaprogramming might just end up undermining all of C scripting Mark II, and we might just say, you know, the route to go here is to use your symbol set to generate a metaprogram, or to run a metaprogram that generates a more baked down version of what you actually want. I don't love that, mostly because I just don't like the extra complexity of the two-step build that comes with any metaprogramming. If it were avoidable, that would be cool. But if it's not avoidable because it's so much better and it's almost trivial with everything else worked out, there doesn't have to be an input program. It's not really a separate. It's not a super separate thing you have to build and deal with. It's just a portion of your code that gets compiled into a program that has a different entry point. That could be okay. That could be okay. There might be a full way of managing metaprogramming that's actually goes deeper than I'm thinking with C scripting that I'm just now kind of realizing. Like it could be that you have multiple stages of your metaprogramming could all be managed with a C scripting system underneath it somehow. Kind of an attractive direction. Like it makes metaprogramming more deep than I thought of a thing to look into there. I think that's just about everything I want to include. Plugin architect question. Sorting is part of the question. That it's a minor question. Port tools. These are all just things. That's just all stuff that's going to come from having OBJ utilities developed right here. Kind of like exactly. That's that one. Now, finally, there's this Frontier. So we got Frontier 1 is sort of my objects, images, and I threw in the plugin architecture stuff that has kind of been lurking for a long time. Almost a separate issue that's just been lurking because I wasn't quite ready to finish it. But it fits very nicely in with the rest of this because of the fact that it ultimately touches C scripting too. But it is a little bit of a separate bubble there. The final part is the RPG simulator one. Come up here and we look at the tech tree. In the RPG simulator. Then these kind of work as they're like dependent on other things, right? So they're dependent on certain parts of C scripting research. They're dependent on certain parts of the metaprogramming, C scripting research, and the object file development over here, like, all of this stuff might get better if the C scripting gets better. So all of these are drivers for them in the sense that in order to achieve them from the RPG simulator project, I have to learn how to do them, and then that's how it's driving the research. So even though it's a dependency, it actually kind of comes first. I do this to drive these, right? And so what I want to map out here are the different pieces of the RPG simulator that I'm thinking about working on and where they connect with the research projects. Right, so these down here are like research projects here, and this up here is the driver project. If that makes sense. And let's see, the tile board. Yeah, so over here we've got the tile board structure, which I've developed a prototype for. I'll mark that as done, but there are areas for improvement. Then let me mark up how we could do optimized tile board. And that is going to drive following things. That's going to drive inlining problem. And it's going to drive metaprogramming question. And kind of in parallel, but connected to that, is I could set up performance, I could set up profiling for the RPG simulator. I haven't done. That is going to drive the C scripting problem of profile blur IDs. And that is going to go hand in hand with developing optimizations for the tile board. Then there's the RPG simulator plugin architecture. Which I have not developed, which would drive base layer plugin architecture. Well as the C scripting plugin and handmanship. C scripting plugin architecture. And that may actually be a prerequisite to this. So I'm going to mark this as a soft prerequisite. The thing is, if I do this first, that could be fine. I could learn a lot about the inlining problem and the metaprogramming problem and the profiler IDs problem. But all of that, again, might change as soon as there's a plugin architecture in the mix, right? And so it might pay off to do this first and just do all this once. On the other hand, maybe the research that this is driving is good enough to do twice in two different contexts and learn from both perspectives. I'm not sure. It's definitely the case that to build the plugin architecture, we're going to have to build a lot more of the game rules. The way the plugin architecture is real is that it isn't just a toy, it actually serves a purpose. And for it to serve a purpose in the RPG simulator, it would need to be serving the purpose of developing a system of like modularity, of plugging in and extending the game rules from a DLL. And so I would need to have an actual meaningful distinction of like what does a cluster of game rules look like that I could imagine chopping out of the game or introducing into the game. And that might not be something I already have. Uh, that might be something where I have to build something out that's big enough to serve as a full plugin to the system, right? Another way I could look at it, though, is that I might just want to take everything I've got and split it into two plugins and say there is no core rules at all. Everything is coming in through a plugin architecture. That's a different style of plugin architecture, might have some advantages. And then I'm just picking a spot where to put a split and no particular division line in theory is meaningful, although it might have optimization and performance implications if I split a bunch of stuff that is tightly coupled across a boundary. The maintenance and performance implications might be significant. That wouldn't be surprising, but like a reasonable split should be reasonably optimizable, right? So if I were going to work on the plugin architecture thing first, I would also be needing to spend more time developing rules, is what I suspect. But again, I guess I can mark this as like a soft action. Not necessarily needed to go first. It would be more real if it did. Um, Another way to mark that is they're all kind of linked to like this is informed. If I'm going to write more game rules, how I write game rules within the plugin architecture is kind of a pairwise development, and how I'm going to optimize the tile board structure within the plugin architecture is kind of a pairwise development. They all feed each other a little bit. Um, Now, another thing to work on here is the core. That's just an ongoing thing. It's not really missing. In a way, it's done, but there's just a lot of flow back and forth between this and the idea of a plugin architecture, the game rules continuing to evolve, and it also interconnects with the need for um, uh, entity system. We actually don't have, and then a structured log system. And then there's the serialization, deserialization problem, which depends at least on the entity system, possibly on the there might be some interconnect here because these two might want to do something like this might be a delta system for this as well as a readable structure for the visualizer stuff that feeds back into improving the core, and it also drives the serialization deserialization, C scripting questions. And then once we have a structured log in better shape, that unlocks for us the possibility to go and look more into the animation system. Which is a piece of the graphical system. Have that yet? That feed graphical system that makes it better. We do have the graphical system up, but we're still building out subparts. Hello, new folks. I don't know how long you've been sitting there since you said hello, but hello. I just checked and saw you for the first time. But there's other stuff with the graphical side that I wanted to build out. I mean, yeah, there's just these sort of low-level to-dos that need to happen first, or just about anything else makes. Right, so there's another C system here, asset system. C scripting for an asset. And at some point here, we want to develop the believe developing this. Oh, or of the graphical system. Also going to drive that asset idea. Where else I go? Debug, view, and control. Right, so to get to right, so this is all just C scripting for UI. So this is another question I want to explore. What does the C scripting for UI look like? Let's not call that debug because that's a little confusing. Call that developer. Which kind of only possible once we've made a little progress on both animation and the binding of assets, that would serve to drive the by interaction search. Right. Um, Now that also wants to, it has a connection because I want to develop that thing called the auto tweaker point. That might help to drive auto tweaker, which itself drives debug file parsing. And while I'm at it, also mention that the optimized tile board might also drive debug file parsing. Because if we had that, we could get to, let me do this the other way around. This would drive the symbol graphing, which depends on right. So, and debug file parsing is something we have to get to before we can ever talk about actually getting to C scripting Mark II. So, the question now is, what steps do I take in the RPG simulator next to drive unlocks effectively in the region? How much time do I devote to each piece of the RPG simulator project? Did I skip anything else? The shader, debug, view, and control. Right, so in addition to all of this, there's finding some states to visuals. It's also just the development of graphical effects. Which includes like shaders, also like procedural generators, so on. That is going to be kind of the aim of having better binding systems and feeds into the core of the graphical stuff, and that would drive scripting shader management. Question. And it would drive the object file tech for OBJ from raw. Okay, so hard to keep yourself at the same resolution because I'm always zooming out, I guess. You gotta look at the whole thing and then draw from there. But the question is, where do I want to focus my assets? Optimization. This does look like it's got a lot of immediate payoff. This is a long road. entity system, serialization, deserialization system. The graphical effect stuff is actually way out. I should also do that downstream of this. So the UI stuff, the shader management stuff, that's all pretty now. I'd have to skip ahead a lot. Now that's not always a terrible thing to do. If you skip ahead, what you essentially end up doing is driving all the things behind it to catch up. This might be a huge leap. Animations itself is not. Honestly, I probably shouldn't even mark graphical as done. What I should say is that this is development. There are some things to do just first. We'll have renderer cleanup. Really should come for that's not going to inform scripting or any other research. Very precondition of the RPG simulator. But I think what I'm kind of feeling looking at this is that the pressing problems that I want to solve, like I'm very close to solving this plugin architecture testing for the base layer. And I could just develop out some more game rules and start dabbling with the plugin architecture and then focus on this. Like, this is all low hanging fruit, essentially. That means there'll be no time for the fun graphical stuff. This is all gonna. There's a lot of game engine work to do on this half here that isn't necessarily all very densely populated with opportunities to drive my project, right? Now at the top of this, we end up getting into the deep stuff. Like this is where I would get to have reasons to do debug file parsing stuff. Over here, I can get to that faster. But the debug file parsing, we should also respect as a huge aside. It's going to take a good amount of time to get that up and running for any one platform. So with that, I now need to kind of spend some time and think about which of these things really which of these things is really going to be interesting for me to work on the short term? What can I set as a checkpoint that is worth achieving here? And I think the best thing, like the thing that really speaking to me is maybe looking at the optimization stuff. I feel like there's a lot of density of ideas right here, and there's not a lot of only interconnect would be the plugin thing. Maybe I do the plugin architecture first. The issue with that is just I feel like it's going to push me to develop more game rules too. If I do this first, I can kind of just clean this up and getting all the questions. Except for this one, hard one. But I just drive one of all kind of Uh, work up. Base layer plugin. That does sound really tempting to look at the plugin compatibility when I got it too. That is the other one that's really tempting. And a part of the reason why that's tempting is I think there are a couple of projects that I am observing and kind of making minor contributions to and stuff. I've been in discussion with other developers who are working on stuff who I'd love to deliver them a pitch on a great way to architect their plugin system. And so maybe I want to toy with that for then look at optimization opportunities. That and use that as an excuse to build out more game rules so that I can have more fun. Because this is honestly, this right here, let's just like annotate important information. This is maximally fun. That's important to note. So that's a part of the reason why I'm drawn to this. Yeah. I think it's gonna be plugin architecture and tileboard, and then entity system, serialization, structured log animation, and then assets and on to the developer tools. I think that's roughly the trajectory of the RPG Simulator project, and the research that gets dragged along the way will just follow. Are there any things here that I don't have? Like that shows up, symbol dependency graphing shows up, debug utilities, they show up. This barely shows up. That object file generating. This shows up at the very end for. Well, no, it doesn't. So, scripting, yeah, okay. So the project stuff I've got going on right now is gonna give me incentive to build out the debug file parsing and eventually an auto tweaker. None of this reaches into getting to the C scripting Mark II. I don't have a driver for that is super deep. I guess except for this. The optimizing of the tile board is sort of the thing, like inlining problem. That is a big driver for the metaprogramming and C scripting Mark II stuff. Okay. Right. Just to clear that up. The inlining problem is going to be something that I'm not quite sure how we'll solve it, but there's ideas, and those ideas include OBJ post processing, which is a Mark II piece, and the metaprogramming there. So, all right. I think my goal, I'm not sure when I'll start this. I might keep taking a couple days to go slow before I get into it. But I think my goal for the next, based on looking at all the things I want to be working on here, my goal for the next few weeks is going to be to develop out some game rules and a plugin architecture for the core. And once the plugin architecture for the core is up and running, I will use that to investigate the base layer questions, and I will use that to investigate the C-script plugin architecture questions. As they relate to C scripting Mark 1, and let that bleed into more of the tileboard stuff. I think we're going to just focus on this. That feels achievable to me as a goal for the next few weeks to scope in on that, which means I'm not going to touch graphics for a bit. It's going to be a little while before I get to the aliasing problem or looking at the animation questions and stuff like that. But we'll be getting there later. So I think I'm happy with that as a thought. I'm gonna let this sit with me for a day, and maybe in the next couple days I will off stream start toying with this direction. And if it's working, then we'll maybe come back to the stream and take this on full bore. If there's something off with my approach, I will keep brainstorming and come back for another brainstorming session another time. But I think that's about it for today. I don't actually know if I have ended up with like a nice tidy thing I can post somewhere yet. Honestly, I just got so much stuff I want to get to. But I think that this is what I wanted to accomplish for today. I'm gonna keep this in mind. And thanks for coming and hanging out and watching me brainstorm my project directions and stuff, and just talk about what I'm working on. And I will see you all around the internet later.